morning. We're here today to give you some background for the antique stove that was recently purchased by the Walpole Historical Society. I'm Barbara Bartholomew from the Norfolk Historical Commission.
And I'm Charles Hardy from the Walpole Historical Society. And this is like a culmination of a 10-year effort to find out about the Walpole Iron Foundry, and it's all culminated in the acquisition of one of the products of that foundry, a cooking stove made back in the 1830s.
All right, we'll begin here. We're going to leave the studio and take you down Main Street to the cemetery, up Seekonk Street, across the railroad tracks, and on your right you're going to see a street sign that says Campbell and Seekonk. We're going to take a right on Campbell and start down the hill, and a little way down the hill we'll see a second street sign which reads Old Campbell and Campbell, which is where the old road used to connect with the mill site. As we reach near the bottom of the hill, we'll pause for a moment and look to our left, and if we had been back here in 1825, we would have seen this magnificent building, this brick building, or brick house as it was called, which was built by Squire Miller Fales, who was the founder of the Walpole Foundry. Across the street on the knoll, we see a small bungalow perched there, and this is the Morse House at 18 Campbell, and it was built. Some parts of it were the original parts of it were built around 1720 by Benjamin Morse, and it still sits on its original site. We proceed down Campbell Street, and ahead we see some cement posts on the left side and some cement blocks on the right side, and that marks what was called in the early days Morse's Brig, Brig being a Scottish term for bridge. As we reach the bridge, we see to our right this structure, and we can identify this as being the last standing structure from the mills that occupied this site along the Stop River for over 200 years. And this is the remnants of the last paper mill that was there. And during the period of the 1940s and 50s, Carl Nelson operated a one-man auto repair service out of this building. We've stopped the car now, and we've got out and walked beside that building, and we see water rushing down a channel, and you find that this is the term for this particular body is the Grindle, which in olden times meant the ditch. And what it actually represents, it is the water that's coming over the spillway at the dam, which is further upstream. And if you look very carefully at this picture on the left-hand side, you'll see elements of another passageway, which is actually the sluiceway that ran under the mills. This is a picture of the same site back in the late 1930s without all of the greenery covering it up, and we get a clearer view of the structures that were there, or many are still there and buried under the trees and brush. And we get a better view of the Grindle coming down, and then to the left, that feed in of the sluiceway from under the dam. We walk across the street or over the bridge to the other side of the street and look down, and there are two iron rails at the present time serving as on the edge. And we look down and we see the Stop River that has passed under Campbell Street and is now on its way north, where it will swing to the west just beyond Noon Hill and will empty into the Charles River up in Medfield. Back in the car, we start on our way again, and ahead we see this building on our left as we approach. And if we had been here 5 years ago, this is what you probably would have seen and are probably familiar with. This is the same house as it was when the Nichols family lived there from 1961 until about 2010. And then after Mr. Nichols passed away, his sons sold the building, and a young man by the name of Matthew Award renovated it, and this is that same building as it looks today. And it's a beautiful addition to the Stop River Falls area. Just past, as we turn the corner, we see what the old-timers call the Arch Bridge, which carries the railroad over Campbell Street. And you may question as to why we say Arch Bridge, and the answer is quite simple. That originally there was an arch on this bridge in 1849 when it was built, but in 1890 the New York and New England Railroad decided to add a second track and needed to widen the bridge and therefore remove the arch. Further down this railroad line out in East Douglas, you will find a similar arch bridge, and this bridge carries Wallam Lake Road over the same railroad track, and was probably built. It was built in the early 1850s, and was probably built by the same stonemasons that worked here at Stop River Falls and built our arch bridge. And one note of oddity: Bertha Fales, our town historian, spent many hours at her grandfather's house, and her grandfather was Silas Fales, right next to the arch bridge. After Bertha sold the family home in Norfolk in 1935, she moved to East Douglas, and she bought a little cottage on on Lake Wallam Road, less than a mile from this very arch bridge, which certainly must have given her many memories of her home and her years growing up in Norfolk. Now we turn ourselves around to head back, and we're passing back under the arch bridge, and we find a perfectly framed picture of the beautiful Silas Fales house. Silas, of course, built this house in 1850 with monies he received from the Norfolk County Railroad when they paid him for the right-of-way through his property to lay their track. We're headed back to Stop River and the Stop River Falls, and we're going to look at a new era, an era when it all began in the late 1600s, about 1680. And you may question why we call this Stop River Falls, and the answer is quite simple, that back in the 1600s there was a magnificent waterfall here, that the Stop River came through a depression in the ledge, and when it reached the edge of the ledge, the waters dropped some 18 feet to street level, and it must have made a very magnificent sight. And therefore the name Highland Lake, which if you recognize where we are, Highland Lake was not applied to this sector of Norfolk until the 1875, when the New York and New England Railroad built an excursion park and named it Highland Lake Grove. And the Highland Lake Station, of course, brought the patrons from Boston to come to the Grove. This is a map that shows the layout at Stop River Falls, and that basically we have in 1680, Jeremiah Morse, who was a wheelwright in Medfield, came to this area and discovered a beautiful stand of hardwood trees. And being a wheelwright, he sought a source of hardwood supply to make the wheels, and then he recognized that the water source or the waterfall would be ideal, of course, to create a water-powered sawmill. Almost simultaneously, after he had purchased the acreage here at the Falls site, the town of Wrentham made an offer that they would give a privilege to anyone willing to build a good corn mill on the Stop River. So taking advantage of that, Jeremiah dammed the river, and he built his grist mill on the east bank of the river, and he built a sawmill on the west bank, as depicted here on the map. The Morse family appears to have run this sawmill collectively until the 1700s. And then in 1741, the heirs of Jeremiah deeded all of the rights and property to their youngest, to Benjamin Morse, in 1741. And Morse had previously built a home for himself up on the hill, the Morse House, which we saw before, and that basically was built around 1720. After Benjamin got control of the site, he rebuilt the dam, and having rebuilt the dam, he created 3 sluiceways, one for the grist mill, one for the sawmill, and the third he created for a blacksmith shop, and the blacksmith was James Blake Jr., who just happened to be his brother-in-law. And he sold to James Blake 1/3 rights of the use of the dam to power his blacksmith shop, which included a trip hammer. Now, I mention that because here we have a picture of Charles, and he's examining what's left. And it's up behind that Morse house. We see this stone foundation, and this was the foundation for the blacksmith shop, which was remarkably large. And Charlie measured it and found it to be 31 feet by 49 feet. And then the question is, why so big? Well, if you realize that he was a blacksmith, but he was also apparently running a forge, because why else would he have the trip hammers to hammer the pig iron? If he were simply a blacksmith, he would use his anvil and his own manpower. So it would appear that this was a combination forge and blacksmith shop. And it operated here for almost half a century. The next thing, or the last thing I'd like to bring to your attention, is that around the turn of the 1800s, many changes would occur. For one, Peter Morse, who had inherited the sawmill from his father Benjamin, traded it for his uncle Amaziah Fales' farm on West Street. And the Fales came into the site. When Amaziah died, he left his property to his 2 sons, to Peter and Nathan. And that basically then the water rights were now being divided and subdivided. So when we looked at the situation around 1790, at the time of Amaziah's death, we would find that the water rights had been fractured, and you had a situation where the blacksmith shop had 1/3 of the rights, that Amaziah had 1/3, and that the other 1/3 still belonged in the Morse family. But when Amaziah died, his 2 sons, Aaron Clark Fales and Nathan Fales, each got half, so we're now down to 1/6. So we have 1/3, 1/6, 1/6, and 1/3. When the 1800s arrived, after Amaziah's death, and then shortly thereafter, the blacksmith James Blake would die, the son, Aaron Clark, decided that he wished to consolidate control of the dam, and so he set upon a course to accomplish this. His first move was to buy out the blacksmith's rights, and he acquired thus 1/3 more. So adding that to his 1/6, he now had 1/2 rights in the dam. The next step was to go after the Morse shares, and by that time, the 1/3 rights to the dam were in the hands of Nancy Morse, who had inherited them from her father. And so Aaron proceeded to purchase the rights from Nancy, and he now had 5/6, or control of the dam. The other 6 remained with his brother Nathan, and Nathan had a son, Squire Miller, and Squire Miller had grown up here at Stop River Falls, and he had been around the forge and the foundry, and that after the death of James Blake in 1805 as a boy, he had worked with his cousins in terms of operating the forge and foundry. He went off to war in the War of 1812, and when he came back, he was of a mind now to build a real foundry here at Stop River Falls. And at this point, his uncle, Aaron Clark, agreed to lease him his 5/6 rights. So with his father's 1/6, he now had full control and could proceed. And now I'll turn it over to Charlie, and he'll show you how this foundry came to be.
Okay, so we're up to 1825, and so now the question is, how did they smelt iron back in 1825? And the place to begin is by looking at the raw materials that are needed for making iron. Here's a sample of bog iron. This comes not from an open mine, but from a wetland. When you walk through a wetland, sometimes you can see a film of red coloring on the surface of the water flowing through glacial soils, indicating that there is iron in solution. This water makes contact with oxygen in the air to form a compound, ferrous oxide, which we know as rust. The technical name for this kind of iron ore is limonite, a very low grade containing 30 to 40% iron. The problem, of course, is how to retrieve the iron from the rust compound. Sometimes at the bottom of the wetland, modules form of bog iron, and the wetlands have to be dredged to bring this stuff up and to dry it and then to pulverize it and make it ready for smelting. Now the second ingredient is charcoal. This is partially burned wood. It takes 4 cords of wood to make 100 bushels of charcoal. So what they did was to stack the wood in wigwams, and a guy called a collier looked after the fire. It had to smolder. They didn't want the thing to erupt in flames. They just wanted to turn it into charcoal. So of course the whole landscape was stripped of forests by this great demand for charcoal. The third ingredient is the charcoal when it's ready to be put into the mix. The third ingredient is calcium, to be used as a flux in smelting of iron. Calcium carbonate or limestone made a good flux, but in some places oyster and clam shells were also used. Fortunately for the operation of Stop River Falls, there was a limestone outcrop less than a mile away. The rock was quarried and then powdered and burned, partially burned, in a kiln to drive out all moisture. And the remains of that kiln is still obvious today. This is the lime kiln off Lincoln Road. It's about 1,000 feet into the woods from Lincoln Road. It's just as it was back 175 years ago. So, all the needed ingredients for iron smelting were found in the Walpole area. Bog iron was dredged from Robbins Land along Mine Brook, or was brought in from off Granite Street, or from Spring Brook or nearby Medfield. The charcoal came, of course, from an ever-widening area. And then the dam on the Stop River provided water power needed to operate the bellows, which forced air into the bloomery or furnace, and like Barbara said, powered the trip hammers to pound the iron to make wrought iron, so-called. These materials were moved by cart.
I messed up.
This is an ore cart of the type that was used back then. And we should mention that there have always been bloomeries in operation in the Norfolk Walpole area. They consisted of a shallow pit in the ground in which the bog iron, charcoal, and flux were piled up and then ignited. The result was a bloom or a puddle of iron, which had to be wrought, beaten with hammers to drive out the impurities. The resulting iron product was brittle and of limited use. So the blast furnace that Shepherd Leach and Squire Miller Fales built in 1825 was a giant leap in technology. Now, Barbara and I have looked at the iron smelting process and the site at Stock River Falls, and we've conjectured as to the layout of the operation in 1825. As you can see, the furnace is a massive stone structure with a high chimney, and materials were loaded in from the top into that part of the furnace called the crucible, where the fire was. And at the bottom of the furnace, the liquid iron ran out into molds. And of course, there were necessary buildings for foundry operations, and it must have been a very busy place back in 1825. Men with wheelbarrows and stacks of wood and people coming and going. We should talk about the chemistry of iron smelting. It's a very simple process, and it's really quite clever. Excuse me. Charcoal is 100% pure carbon. So it combines with the oxygen in ferrous oxide to produce carbon monoxide gas, which goes up the chimney, leaving the iron behind. The iron is liquefied and drops to the bottom of the pile, and the flux absorbs impurities, such as sulfur, and forms slag, the waste rock, which is often vitrified by the high temperatures. By vitrified, we mean that part of the waste rock turns to glass, and you can see the shiny surface. The bellows bring in oxygen and allow the mix to reach over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Here's a sample of slag. I don't think there's any vitrification on this sample. And this is the layout of the foundry operation. They had to build the furnace fairly close to the dam because of the need for the water power. Even though the railroad, when it came through in 1849, obliterated all evidence of the furnace, we can pretty much recreate the layout of the buildings. Now, the original iron furnaces injected cold air into the mix, which raised the temperature inside somewhat. And this diagram shows the operation. The water wheel produces the mechanical power, which forces the bellows, and then out the bottom comes the liquid iron. Now, all of this has to take place in a furnace, which has to be a massive stone structure in order to contain the heat. A high chimney of 20 feet or higher was needed to create a draft to draw out the gases. At the base of the chimney was the crucible where the raw materials were mixed, and then at ground level was the hearth where the liquid iron flowed out into a channel called the sow. And off the sow were several sand molds or pigs. The diagram shows how the iron was cast. They made molds from wooden patterns and pressed them into moist sand and poured the liquid iron into the mold. Meanwhile, slag was shoveled out of a side door and unceremoniously dumped nearby. Those who tended the furnace were called molders, and their craft was as much an art as a science. Squire Miller Fales, his uncle, and his sons were all molders. After his relationship with his partner, Shepherd Leach, went sour, Squire Miller ended up in Baltimore, Maryland, where he operated a foundry and apparently made a lot of money. By 1868, he was ailing, and he decided to retire to Walpole, where he built a large house with his son-in-law on top of Powder House Hill near downtown. He and his wife, unfortunately, quickly sank to their graves. Not until Barbara and I began this project was Squire Miller Fales restored to his proper place in local history after 150 years of obscurity. By 1839, this iron smelting technology was outdated. The new fuel was bituminous coal, which is partially burned into coke. To obtain the high temperatures, heated air was pumped into the furnace. The iron came from mines in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and later from Upper Michigan. New England no longer had an advantage, but the furnace at Stop River Falls operated from 1825 to 1839, creating wealth for investors and also for the local farmers who supplied wood, provisions, labor, and transport. And consumers had access to valuable cast iron goods, such as cooking stoves, which greatly improved their quality of life. This is the way the cooking stove looked when it was first seen on eBay. And later it was acquired by the Walpole Historical Society and refurbished, and this is the way it looks today. What we want to show you is how the stove works and where it was installed in the Walpole Historical Society headquarters.